Welcome to the 8th tutorial of my Tableau Server Client series. This series is dedicated to showcasing how to use Tableau Server Client to automate various tasks. In this video, I will walk you through the process of generating a report containing important details on each of the workbooks published to your Tableau Server. I will show you how to query your Tableau Server for information on each workbook using Tableau Server Client and subsequently write that information to an Excel workbook. Before jumping into the coding aspect of this video, allow me to speak to this type of report's use cases. A workbooks report allows you to understand what your Tableau server looks like in terms of workbooks. It allows you to answer questions like, how many total workbooks does our Tableau server currently contain? How many workbooks are owned by each user? Which user owns each workbook? What are the details of each workbook? When was each workbook created and last updated? What are the names of the sheets contained within each workbook? And how many times has the workbook been viewed? Gathering usage statistics for each of your published workbooks is always a good idea. There is the saying, build it and they will come, but if you have been in the reporting and analytics space for even a short amount of time, then you know that this is not always the case. For rarely viewed workbooks, work with the stakeholders to understand why the dashboards or reports within the workbooks are not as popular as you had hoped. For those workbooks that are viewed quite often, and by many users, avoid simply chalking it up as a success. Instead, try to understand why the workbook is viewed often and by so many. Look for ways to apply what you learned to your future dashboards and reports. Having briefly discussed the use cases, I will now jump over to Visual Studio Code to begin writing a script to generate a report on the workbooks published to my Tableau server. For this example, I am going to send a request to my Tableau server to provide a list of all workbooks existing on the server. After retrieving that list of workbook objects, I will start by creating a simple report that provides important details on each workbook. I'll then further develop the structure and contents of this report by incorporating what you learned in my video on generating a user's report to include each workbook's owner details within the report. At the end of this walkthrough, I will show you how to write the report to an Excel file for reporting and dissemination purposes. The first step I need to take is to configure my connection to the Tableau server. If you are unfamiliar with how to configure a connection to your Tableau server for authentication purposes, please watch video 2 of this series. In that video, I walk through connecting to Tableau server for the first time. I will also place the link to the video in the comments section. After configuring the connection details, I can begin working towards a solution that will generate the desired workbooks report. I need to use the Tableau Server Client object I configured in the first code block to sign in. I have went ahead and started off the second code block by doing just that. I am using a context manager to ensure I stay signed in while attempting to access information on my Tableau server. Additionally, this ensures that I also sign out each time. Okay, to begin generating this workbooks report, we need to first run this initial block that's going to configure our Tableau Server Client object. Second, we'll sign in to the server. And what I want to do here is I want to access, so if I need the workbooks maintained on my server, I'm going to access the workbooks endpoint. So I'm going to say workbooks equals workbook for workbook and tsc pager server.workbooks. And this is me accessing the workbooks endpoints for my server. We're going to generate a list of workbook objects. So one object per workbook maintained in my server. Let's go ahead and run that. Let's take a look at this workbooks list. All right. So based on this list, we have 4 workbooks on my server. And here are those objects, right? So we have 4 workbook objects or items. Let's take a look at the attributes maintained for each of these workbooks. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to access the first workbook item or object in this workbooks list. I'm just going to look at the dictionary representation of this. Okay, so we have quite a few attributes maintained for each workbook. The attributes that I feel are important for your everyday workbooks report are going to be the ID, so the locally unique identifier. That's going to allow you to tie each workbook to a particular user or to some other object that's maintained on the server through some endpoint. The owner ID, so who owns the workbook. The workbook name, the date the workbook was created, and the date it was last updated at. The URL for which you can find that workbook. The project ID and project name. So where does this workbook sit on my server? What I want to do is I want to take those attributes from each of these objects and extract them. And the end result, we'll want a pandas data frame. So to do that, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to come out here and I'm going to say create a data frame containing workbook information. To do this, I'm going to say workbook info equals pd.dataframe. And then we'll provide a list of key value pairs. The keys are going to be the column names for my data frame, and the values are going to be a series of list comprehensions that are going to extract each corresponding attribute from each object, or workbook in this case. So let's go ahead and start off. I'm going to say workbook ID, say workbook.id for workbook, and workbooks. And what we're doing here again is we're going to go through or iterate through our workbooks list and go through each workbook and extract just the ID value. And those are going to be maintained in a column named workbook ID. The rest of this is going to be more or less a copy paste because we're going to do the same thing, except we're going to substitute the attribute we're extracting for each workbook object. So let me just go ahead and copy and paste a few of these. And let's change the name. So I'm going to say owner ID. I'm going to name created at updated at project name. And let's do these let's do project name second and the ID first. This doesn't matter, it's just me being obsessive compulsive about things. Okay, so we have the column names as the keys, and the values we need to update each of these additional list comprehensions to make sure we're pulling out the right attributes. So if we look here, again, I don't have this memorized, right? So, well, some of them I do, but most of the time I'm looking at the dictionary representation of each of these objects. And I see that owner ID is owner_ID. I see that name for the workbook is just name. Created it, updated it, and so forth. We can find those all here. Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and populate those attributes here. Let's go owner ID, name, created at, updated at. This should actually be last updated at, right? Let's see. So last updated at, or no, it should be updated at. So let's do updated at, and then the project ID, and then the project name. And let's remove this comma. Let's go ahead and run this. Okay, so we successfully ran this block, and it should have created me a data frame that has all of my workbook details for each workbook maintained on my server. So let's go ahead and look at this data frame. All right, so we have 4 workbooks, and captured for each workbook is the ID, the owner ID, the name, the date for which the workbook was created, updated at, the project ID, and the project name. This is as expected, right? Because we specifically outlined which attributes we want to extract for each workbook and to put those into a data frame. All right, now we have our workbook info data frame that contains valuable information maintained for each workbook. But you may be thinking, okay, so I have these workbooks, but what if I want to know how frequently or how often these workbooks are viewed by my users? Well, unfortunately, the usage statistics aren't going to be stored directly within each workbook object and available at the workbook's endpoint. So if we go here and I access that first workbook again, we scroll through here and we look for an attribute that's called total views. It may not be in here. And it's not. So what we need to do is to get the total views for each workbook is we need to access the views endpoint. So the views endpoint, and what I want to make clear here is when I say view, this is another synonymous term with worksheet as far as Tableau is concerned. So we're going to access the views endpoint, which is going to allow you to access each worksheet or the data corresponding to each worksheet maintained in each workbook. So if a workbook has 5 sheets, it's going to have 5 view objects associated with that workbook. So let's go ahead and do that now. This is going to allow us to get the usage statistics behind each of these workbooks and their views. So let's do gather all workbook views. And again, that is sheets. So we're going to say views is equal to, so it's going to look largely like our workbook list comprehension. So it's view for view and tsc.pager server.views. And let's just go ahead and put a space in between here, or a line, extra line in between there. All right, so I'm just going to run this again so we can look at the views endpoint. All right, so let's look at views. We have a lot of views, right? So quite a few views. How many views do we have? Let's take a look. We have 19 views. And let's look at those. Let's look at the attributes maintained for each of these view objects or worksheets. So I'm going to say views, access the first view in the list of views, and look at the dictionary representation of this. So we have the content URL, we have the created dates, the ID, a slew of other attributes. We also have total views. And if you notice here, it's not populated. So what do we need to do here? We need to actually populate the views for each of these workbooks and worksheets. To do that, it's pretty straightforward. I just need to come back up to the creation of my views list and come here. When I'm accessing the endpoint, I'm going to say usage is equal to true. This is going to ensure as each view is being populated that its usage statistics are being populated and included within the view object returned. All right, so let me rerun this. And let's take a look at this first view object again. You'll notice now instead of returning none, we have an attribute total views that has 3 in it. So it has 3 views so far. Now what I want to do is I want to take this information for each of these views and create a data frame that's going to contain the number of views per workbook. And why am I going to do this? So I'm going to get the number of views per workbook and eventually merge that back with this data frame so that I can include that for each of these workbooks, along with the corresponding details we've already captured within the workbook info data frame. So let's go ahead and do that. So create a data frame containing number of views per workbook. And to do that, I'm going to say total views per workbook is equal to pd.dataframe. And I'm going to do something that may come off as a little complicated at first, depending on where you're at in your Python learning journey, but I'll explain this here shortly. So I'm going to say view._dict for view and views. And what I'll do is let's just go ahead and run this so that we can look at the resulting data frame and talk about it. Okay, so let's look at total views per workbook. What this has done is it's basically unpacked each of these views into a row within this data frame. So we've taken all of the keys. So we said view_dict for view and views. So for each view object, we have the keys, which are going to serve as the columns, so the column names, and the values for each of those corresponding keys are going to be maintained in that column. So again, we have those 19 views starting at index 0, so it goes to 18, and each of those are represented within a single row. All right, so we have 1 row per view. Now we want to get the total views per view. So I'm gonna actually say total views per sheet in here in that case because it's kind of confusing. So total views per worksheet within a workbook. So I'm gonna say group by, and then what am I gonna group by? I'm gonna group by workbook ID. And why am I typing it like this, _workbook ID? Well, that's because the attribute maintained for the workbook ID attribute is actually represented that way, right? It's _workbook_ID. Now what I want to do here, I want to group the rows by the workbook ID, but I then want to sum the total views attribute. So I'm going to say total views. What this is going to do is that's going to take each of the sheets corresponding to the workbook and compute a sum across those sheets and represent those as a single row per workbook ID. So let's do that, and then I'm going to say dot sum. And then we can go ahead and look at this again. Take a look at what we have. And we have this, right? So we have 1 row per workbook ID in the corresponding views. But what I want to do here is I want to actually go back to the creation of this data frame. I want to reset the index. And then I want to rename some of these columns because workbook ID and what you'll see here _total views is not exactly plain English or report friendly column names. So let's go ahead and rename these. And then for renaming, I'm going to provide a series of column names, so 2 column names, using key value pairs. So I'm going to have the keys are going to be the old column names, and the values are going to serve as the new column names. So I'm going to say Workbook ID. And then I'm going to say Workbook ID. Next one is going to be underscore total views. And let's make that report friendly. So I'm just going to say Workbook total views. Okay. So what we've done here is we've computed the sum across each of the worksheets corresponding to a workbook. We've reset the index, and what that's going to do is it's going to actually give me the column name back. So it's going to, instead of having no column name for total views here, we're going to see Workbook total views, and we'll see Workbook ID based on the renaming. So if I run this, we look at this, we now have a data frame that contains 1 row per workbook, and the sum of the total of the views captured for each worksheet, right? So again, if a workbook has 3 worksheets and they each have 1 view, that's what you'd be seeing here, right? So you'd be seeing a total of 3. Okay, so we've done that. Now we have the total views per workbook. The next thing I want to do, before we merge the workbook info and total views per workbook data frames, I actually want to then go back here, and I want to capture the user information associated with each of these workbooks. Right, because a common question for someone is going to be, okay, I know that we have information on the owner ID, but who is that, right? The average person is not going to memorize these locally unique identifiers that are just a series of numbers and letters. So we want to actually get the user's name and their corresponding information, like maybe their full name, their email address, and their sites role. So what we're going to do is let's just go ahead and say gather all users, and then we're going to access the user's endpoint. So let's just say users equals user for user and tsc.pager server.users. So same strategy for accessing each endpoint and then creating a list of each of the objects. So in this case, we're capturing user objects. So let's go ahead and run this. And then again, we'll just walk through the same process. Let's look at the list. There's 2 users, so 2 user objects. Let's go ahead and take a look at the attributes maintained for each user. So I'm going to take the first object in this list, so first user object, and look at the dictionary representation of that object. So we have the attributes here. The ones we're going to extract are going to be the full name. Let's go ahead and get the site role and the email address. So we're going to create another data frame that contains info for each of our users. All right, so same idea as the workbook info data frame, which is a user info equals PD data frame, and then provide a series of key value pairs. So for the column names, are they going to be the keys? And the values are going to be the actual values maintained for each user. So the user ID, the display name or the full name, and the email address and site role. So let's go ahead and do that now. So I'm going to say user ID, say user.id for user and users. And we'll do the same thing here. So we're just going to do some copy and pasting. So you don't have to watch me type. All right, and we're going to say user display name, then email address, and then site role. And we're going to update the attribute we're extracting. So the display name is the full name. And why do I call it a display name? Well, that's what it's called. When you go to your user account settings on Tableau Server or your Tableau Cloud Server, you're going to see an attribute called display name. And that's going to be the user's full name, first and last name. All right. So continuing, let's go ahead and get the email. Then let's get the site role. And again, some of these I have memorized, but you'll notice the attributes are down here. So site role, name, then the full name, and the locally unique identifier. Again, this is necessary. So why am I pulling this? So it's not useful for your average user consuming the report, but it's going to allow you to tie the user object to another object. In this case, we want to tie it to the workbook info data frame or the workbook objects based on the owner ID for each workbook. So who owns the workbook, or which workbooks are owned by each user. All right, so we now have a user info data frame. And I'm just going to remove this, even though it will let me run that technically. So let's go ahead and look at the user info data frame. We have 2 users, 1 row per user, and the corresponding user ID, display name, email address, and site role captured. Okay, now the big step for creating this report is we're actually going to combine each of these data frames that we've created, right? So we want to combine the workbook info data frame, the total views per workbook, and the user info data frame to get the complete picture of what does our server look like in terms of workbooks. Okay, so let's do that. So I'm going to say create a workbooks report by merging workbook info, let's just say workbook info and user info data frames. Let's say total views. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started on this. So we're going to say workbooks report is equal to workbook info. So this is our data frame containing 1 row per workbook. And we're going to say .merge, fancy word for, so Panis's word for joining, right? So if you have an SQL background, think join. All right, so how are we going to merge these? We're going to say, I want to take the workbook info data frame and merge that with the user info data frame. So I'm going to say right is equal to, so which is the data frame on the right side? That's going to be the total views per workbook, because we're first going to bring in the total views per workbook based on the workbook ID. And I'm going to say how. I'm just going to use enter. And then I'm going to say on. So what are we going to say on? How are these 2 data frames being merged? They're going to be merged based on matching workbook ID values. Okay, so what I'll do here is I'm just going to go ahead and run this. And let's just double check I did this correctly. Okay, let's go ahead and run this. And then let's look at the workbooks report at this intermediate stage. So this is definitely not our final workbooks report. Let's look at what we've done so far. So we have the workbook information, or the workbook details, and then we've also pulled in the workbook total views based on our total views per workbook object. And you'll notice that we have only one version of the workbook ID column, right? So we've used an inner join or an inner merge method, and as a result of the keys matching, one of them were dropped, right? So I don't need to come in here and technically drop one of the values or one of the columns. Next thing I'm going to do here, so we have these 2 data frames merged, so the workbook info and the total views per workbook data frame. Next thing I want to do is I need to bring in the user info associated with each workbook. So let's just go ahead and continue this operation. I'm just going to say .merge and do the same thing, right? So right is equal to user info, how, enter, and then we're going to say left on. So what is the key or value we're going to be matching from the left data frame? We're going to say workbook owner ID. And right on. Right on is going to be a little bit different this time, right? So because we don't have attributes that have the same name, I can't just simply use on, right? So previously I used on and I just said workbook ID. That's because the attribute name matched in both data frames. What we're going to say is left on workbook owner ID, and then in the user info data frame, this value is referenced as user ID. Now, I'm doing this just for demonstrative purposes. You could very well come up here and name these differently, right? And I'm going to do that here in a moment, but you could have just technically said workbook ID, and then you would end up with the same strategy here, right? But I didn't do that. All right. So what we're going to do here now is, because we have, well, when I run this, you're going to see that we have 2 columns capturing the same information. We're going to have workbook owner ID capturing the locally unique identifier for the user. And we're also going to have user ID from the user info data frame capturing the same piece of information. So we're going to drop one of these, but I'm just going to go showcase that now. All right. So we have the workbook owner ID from the workbook info data frame, and then we have the user ID from the user info data frame. These contain the same information, so we're going to drop one of these. Columns, and then I'm just going to say user ID. So I'm going to drop the user ID version of this attribute. And then what I want to do here, I'm I want to rename some of these columns just for reporting purposes and ease of consumption purposes. So I'm going to rename the user display name, the email address, and site role to be workbook owner name, workbook owner email address, and workbook owner site role. All right, let's go ahead and do that now. To do that, I'm just going to use the rename method and provide a list of key value pairs. So I'm going to say columns is equal to, or a series of key value pairs, more like it. So user display name, we're going to rename that to workbook owner name. We're going to rename the user email address to workbook owner email address. Going to rename the user site role to, you guessed it, workbook owner site role. Okay, so let's go ahead and run this, observe those changes. And here we are. So we no longer have the user ID attributes from the user info data frame because we don't need to capture redundant information, right? So we previously mentioned that the workbook owner ID is the same information or captures the same information for each user. We've also renamed the columns user display name, email address, and site role to be workbook owner name, workbook owner email address, and workbook owner site role. The next step I want to take here is I actually want to reorder these columns just to ensure that the attributes or columns directly related to the workbook are together, followed by the project related attributes, followed by the owner related attributes. So who owns the workbook? Let's go ahead and do that. To do that, I'm going to say reindex. And then I'm going to provide explicitly what is the list or the order in which I want the columns to be represented in my data frame. So I'm just going to go and type this out, workbook owner ID. Okay, so we have all of our columns, and what have I done here? So I just need to put an equals here, just fix that syntax error. Basically what we're doing is we're taking this data frame and again, just reordering the columns for ease of use as perceived by me, right? So you may order your columns differently, and it's perfectly fine. This is how I'd like them to be ordered. So let's go ahead and run this, and let's look at the reordering. So we start off with the attributes directly related to the workbook. Then where does the workbook live? So each of these workbooks live in a particular project or folder on my server. So the first two workbooks live in the samples folder. The second two workbooks live in the data quality alerts folder. And then we follow up with the user information associated with the owner of the workbook. So all of these happen to be owned by me. It's my server for demonstrative purposes or these tutorials. So everything's owned by me. All right, so we've successfully created a workbooks report that is sitting in a data frame on my machine in this IDE/editor. Now, that's not going to do anyone any good besides perhaps me. So what I want to do is I want to write this to an Excel workbook so I can actually disseminate this, right? Send this to my peers for reporting purposes, or to publish this to my Tableau server. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to write this to an Excel workbook. But before doing that, what I need to do, and you'll run into this error too if you try to write this data frame to an Excel workbook, you're going to run into an error that basically is the result of our created at and updated at attributes containing time zone aware information. So basically this portion of each date value, right? Each date and time value. What I need to do is I need to remove that. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna say remove time zone information from each value in order, say one order to write to Excel file. And to do that, I'm just going to alter these attributes. I'm going to say workbooks report. And which one do I want to update? I want to update workbook created at. So this is one of two attributes that I need to update. And we'll say equals workbooks report. And how I'm going to do this, I'm going to actually use the datetime module. So I'm going to say .dt. Well, actually, this is the pandas datetime. So I'm going to say .dt.tz underscore localize and say none. So I don't want any time zone information. No specific time zone information captured for each of these workbook created at values. All right. So let's go ahead and run this real quick and let's take a look at what that's done. So keep an eye on this column here. And notice we've stripped that information. So we need to do that for this attribute as well in order to write to Excel. So let's go ahead and do that. And I'm just going to update this and this. All right. Okay, so we successfully stripped the time zone information from each of these attributes, allowing us to write to Excel. Now the last part is, well, let's write this to Excel. So I'm just going to put it down in here since I've already created a block for this. Let's go ahead and create a file path dedicated to writing this information or this workbooks report to an Excel file. Okay, so to do this, what I'm going to do is, in my previous videos, I've sat here and typed out this code. I'm just going to copy and paste it. It's going to be the same code for every single one of my videos for which we're generating reports. I'll explain the code here in just a moment, but I'm going to copy and paste it in here because there is not much, in my opinion, for you to get out of this. Besides, if you've never worked with Pathlib or Pandas to write data to an Excel workbook, then you might learn something new, but you're going to get the same benefits as if I just copy and paste it and then explain the code. All right. So here's the code to write this to a particular path. I'm using Pathlib, which is a library that's going to allow me to create a specific path object. That path object is basically the destination for this workbooks report. So you'll notice here, this is going to be a path on my machine, and I'm putting this in tutorial 8's folder and calling the file workbooks report underscore and following that with the date and time for which this workbooks report was generated. So why am I doing this? I'm doing this because I am going to create more than one workbooks report. And over time, I want to be able to distinguish one workbooks report from another based on the timestamp that has been appended to the file name. It also prevents me from just overwriting a workbooks report that I may not have wanted to overwrite. So we're using the datetime module. We're saying datetime now, using time zone UTC, and then formatting the time to be 4-digit year, 2-digit month, 2-digit day, followed by the hours, minutes, and seconds values. And then using the extension .xlxx, because we want to write this to an Excel file. Now, this is just the path, and keep in mind, you need to ensure that if you're going to use Pathlib, that you've actually imported it. So if you go to the top here and you use this file, if you're using this file, it's already going to be there, but if you're doing this on your own and you want to use Pathlib or you want to use that block of code, ensure that you've actually imported it. Same thing with date, time, and time zone. Okay. The next thing is we're going to use a context manager to open this file and close it automatically and write this data to the Excel workbook. So we're using with PD, so this is a pandas method, so Excel writer. We're passing in the write path, so where are we going to write this data to? We're going to write it to this location, and the file name is workbooks underscore report underscore followed by the date and time for which the report was generated or this code block was ran. And what are we writing? We're writing the workbooks report, so this is our data frame that you see here, to Excel using this writer object. And the sheet name within the Excel workbook is going to be named workbooks as opposed to the default sheet 1 that you would otherwise have encountered if you did not provide a sheet name. Index is equal to false. So what does index equal to false do? It's going to avoid a redundant row numbering system. So in Excel, we have a built-in row numbering system that starts with 1 along the left-hand side of a worksheet and goes through a very large number. Let's just say that. But it starts with 1. So this will be 1, 2, 3, 4. We don't need a redundant row numbering system, so I'm going to ensure that this is not included in the Excel's output. So you will just see these attributes here and not have a redundant row numbering system. Because Excel's row numbering system is perfectly fine, in my opinion. If you don't want to exclude it, then just change this to true. Okay, let's go ahead and write this. And then let's switch over to Excel so that we can actually see the fruit of all this labor, right? So let's see what we have done as a result of running this block of code. All right, so here's our Excel workbook. This is our Workbooks report. It looks exactly like the data frame we're viewing in the IDE. So within Visual Studio Code, we have one row per workbook. We have the workbook information. We have the project information. So where does the workbook live on our server? We have the owner information associated with the workbook's owner, right? Who owns the workbook? Who created this workbook? So now there it is. We have our workbooks report. We've generated it successfully. We can do this today, tomorrow, next day, and we'll have a report name that is workbooks_report followed by the date and time for which it was generated. And that wraps up this video on generating our workbooks reports. I hope you found this tutorial useful and can use the concepts I've covered to level up your ability to manage your own Tableau server through automation. If you enjoyed this video, then please like the video and subscribe to my channel for notifications on future videos. Thank you again, and see you next time.